going to just go ahead and invite Jay Shifman up to share his story. So let's give it up for Jay.
Welcome to the Choose Your Struggle podcast. I am your host, Jay Shifman. Hello and welcome to episode 41 of the Choose Your Struggle podcast. It's a special episode. This might be, maybe, there might be one more. This might be the last special episode of season 1. So if it is, celebration. If it's not, it's cool. We're still going to love it anyway. This episode was originally recorded a couple months ago. It came out in early September. It's with Ali West, who's the host of the Kenetik Fitness Show. He lives in England, so don't be surprised by the accent. And we chatted all things mental and physical health. Really wonderful conversation. Ali's a great guy. He's doing some really cool work. And, you know, I don't choose every interview as a special episode. I haven't counted, but there's like 6 or 7 this season, if that. No, probably like 6, 5, I don't know. But I've done over 50 interviews this year. So that tells you it is the top 10% that go out as special episodes. And it should say something how much I enjoyed this conversation. So enjoy that real quick before this goes out. Tomorrow is election day. Now, obviously, this year's been a little different. We have all been voting for a month. I voted, a month ago. But here's the thing. Tomorrow is the official day. We've all been preparing what we're doing tomorrow, right? We've all been making our plans, whatever the case is. I want to implore you to make a plan for November 4th. Let me tell you why. To quote Israel McCullough, who's a guy that I follow on Instagram who I really like, he said, yes, make plans to vote on November 3rd, but also know where you'll stand on November 4th, because no matter what the results are, we have work to do. For those that aren't sure where I stand personally, like that would really surprise me, but okay. I fully support voting out the fascist regime that has made it very clear that given the chance, they'd be a dictatorship. That's not like an assumption. That's not like, I think he means... No. Trump has literally said he wants to be a president for life, so, vote that bigoted motherfucker out. That being said, on the 3 topics that I cover here, the 3 topics that are most important to me, mental health, substance misuse and recovery, and drug use, Joe Biden is awful. Joe Biden is worse than awful. Joe Biden is terrible. Joe Biden is one of the main reasons that 2 generations of black and brown Americans are sitting in jail while Chet and Hunter get to go to treatment. So vote, and then protest. Because remember, it took our elected leaders a month to add another person to their roles in Amy Coney Barrett, but they haven't passed any legislation to help the rest of us during a global pandemic that has killed millions since March. So if you think voting is the answer, I honestly don't know what to tell you. But still vote, and then protest. All right, without further ado, enjoy this special episode. Y'all know that I love CBD, and almost since day one of this podcast, I've been lucky enough to be sponsored by Mountain Made. And while my wife and I swear by their full-spectrum CBD chewables, sometimes at the end of the day, I need just a little bit more to help me relax. So when my wife is joining me, I pull out a Mountain Made puff, and those are awesome. But when it's just me, they're just a little bit more than what I'm looking for. So what do? I throw a couple of hits from Boston Hempire into my bowl, and it's the perfect way to end the day. Boston Hempire has the finest loose leaf CBD flower and some pretty cool edibles too. So when I add it to everything I'm using from Mountain Made, it is the perfect complement. If you check out Boston Hempire using the link in my show notes or my podcast website, you will be helping out the podcast as well as getting some of the finest CBD flower on the market. So check it out today.
Hey Jay, welcome to the Kenetik Fitness Show podcast. Thank you so much for joining me. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thanks so much for having me. As I was mentioning to you before the show, it's one of my favorite things is to talk to people about these issues, especially in other countries, because they're so important, and meeting other people who care so deeply about them, it really makes my day. So thank you for having me.
100%. It's my pleasure. And it's areas and topics and subject matters that I've been wanting to discuss and put across on this podcast for a while. So I'm glad that I've managed to pin you down, to get you on the show. And I'm excited to discuss these areas with you. But before we do that, would you be able to give myself and the listeners a little bit of a backstory about you, who you are, where you're from, how you help people, and then we will go from there and get stuck into this episode.
Definitely. And again, thanks so much for having me. I live these topics, and I mean that both as the fact that I work in this and my work is my life, but also in the fact that I have lived experience with mental health and substance misuse. I'm from Cincinnati, Ohio, over here in the States, and growing up in a really fantastic environment. My parents are both very loving, and I'm the oldest of four boys. But when I was a preteen, I was diagnosed with ADHD, as many young men especially, but young women as well are. And unfortunately, we know that the medication for these for that treatment comes with some side effects. And that was known back when I was a kid as well, talking the mid-90s. It wasn't as acted upon back then, I'll say it that way. And when I started developing some side effects to this medication, my therapist called it bipolar disorder instead of saying, oh, maybe these are some side effects. And that misdiagnosis would turn into being over-medicated for both of these issues, developing a extreme addiction to my prescription pills. And by the time I was in my early 20s, I was severely misusing every single one of these pills I was on, including also a lot of other substances as well. At 23, I attempted suicide twice. I overdosed, ended up in a lockdown facility, and then finally in a long-term care facility, what we used to call a mental institution. And it was there that I finally discovered what I had sort of maybe considered for a long time, and that was that I was misdiagnosed. I discovered that by meeting people with actual bipolar disorder and people with substance misuse issues, and I started to realize, oh man, like I know what those people with the substance misuse issues are going through. I recognize that. I don't recognize this experience of people with mood disorders. And it was there that I decided to get off all medication, which I did by checking myself out and going to Sedona, Arizona, a little hideaway town in Arizona in the west of here in the United States, where I lived with my grandparents for 4 months, went through detox, and finally restarted my life. I've been in recovery now for 10 years. I've been working in this field and speaking out publicly about it for 5. And now I serve as a speaker, a public speaker, a coach. I work with individuals. I consult with businesses about these topics, and I have my own podcast, the Choose Your Struggle podcast, where we talk about issues of substance misuse, mental health, and drug use.
That was a fast story.
Yeah.
I love that.
Well, I have the 50, actually I have the 30-minute version, which is one of the speeches I give. But, I think at the end of the day, when I'm on podcasts like this, my story is great. I'm not going to minimize it because it is a story of victory. It's a story of overcoming some odds. But at the end of the day, the most important part of my story is the conversations it starts. And that's what, I love doing on these podcasts. So anytime that I take to talk about my story, it makes me think, okay, well, this isn't really about me. This is about this much bigger issue of issues of substance misuse and mental health. So, I try to get it through it as quick as possible.
Yeah. So start off by telling myself and the listeners some of the struggles and the issues that you were having because of this misdiagnosis, because your story is maybe very different to some others that I've heard, in the fact that it was a misdiagnosis that kind of was the catalyst to set all of this in motion. So what sort of things were you going through? What was you experiencing? What did you have to overcome to get out the other side, really?
Definitely. So you're 100% right. And when I tell this story, I get that exactly what you said a lot. And it's not that my story is that unique. It's just not the one we hear that often, right? And when I speak, I mention that. I say, look, my story isn't the one that we heard with Nancy Reagan's, just say no or dare videos. I didn't start misusing substances after a friend passed me a joint underneath the bleachers in 7th grade gym class. That wasn't how this worked. Nor was it the one that we're hearing on all of our headlines right now, which is the opioid epidemic, the crisis around overprescriptions there. So those are the two that have really dominated the airwaves. And there are a lot of other stories underneath that, mine included, that just don't get talked about that often. And unfortunately, I've seen that firsthand, not just by living it, but when I started speaking out about my story, I had 2 other young men from my graduating class, which was a very small class. I went to a private school. My class only had 85 people. And 2 people reached out to me and said, my story is almost identical to yours. And what was so startling about that is we were all in the same math class in 11th grade. And so we were all going through a very similar struggle, and none of us knew the other ones were suffering the way we were. So I think it is very startling. That really startled me because it said just how strong and just how common this sort of occurrence was, and yet we weren't talking about it. And that was one of the catalysts for me to do what I do now. In terms of the actual implications of what was happening to me, I like to think of it as like, look, I have struggled with these issues most of my life. I've had depression. I've struggled with depression since I was a young age. I've had OCD my whole life. I've struggled with anxiety. And these things are all manageable. I mean, a lot of people struggle with these things, and they've almost become common. What these prescriptions did to me was they took these underlying issues and they poured gasoline on it, and they exploded. And so instead of just struggling with sort of, some depression that I needed to work on or some low level anxiety, all of a sudden that was who I was. And, we've all seen those caricatures of people who struggle with OCD, and that's never really been me. I mean, mine is it's more nuanced than that, I think is the best way to put it. But when I was on these chemicals, when my brain, which by the way, a young developing brain, like we all remember what puberty was like, right? So you take that and you add high levels of chemicals to it, of course there's going to be side effects. And for me, mine just was way heightened because of some of these things I was already struggling with. So it sort of turned me into a caricature of all of these individual diagnoses.
Yeah, I get it. I want to just touch as well on the fact that you attempted to take your own life, to commit suicide. Yeah. And this is an area as well that I don't think gets spoken about enough, but just go more. And I know we're going to talk about other things as well, and I don't want to make it all about your story. We're going to touch on other things as well, but I'm intrigued myself, and I know the listeners will be. Just touch on like what state you was in that as a whole human being. So I'm talking physically, mentally, spiritually, emotionally, you could say, like to get to that point where you thought that this is it, that what was you going through, and explain it so we can understand it more effectively.
100%. And by the way, I want to thank you real quick for prefacing it the way you did, that this is a subject that isn't talked about enough, and you couldn't be more right. There's a guy in this industry that I love a lot named Frank King, and he calls himself the mental health comedian. He is a former writer for Jay Leno, who now tours as a suicide awareness speaker. And he and I have chatted a couple times. I had him on the podcast. I was on his. And he calls it the double whammy, because even people in the mental health industry are hesitant to talk about suicide, mostly because there's this outdated idea that if we talk about it, it'll teach people how to do it, which is, I mean, when you say that out loud, it sounds foolish. And yet that is a thing that a lot of people believe. So I fully agree with them. We need to be talking about this more. I personally, where I was at the time, you have to remember that at this point, I'm 23 years old, and I've been now told for over 5 or 6 years that I have a very serious issue of mental health called bipolar disorder. And what was startling for me was I was on all these pills. I mean, I was carrying so many pills around every day that I went through JFK Airport on my way to the Middle East with a bunch of friends. I got pulled out of line at TSA and searched, because I had so many pills in my backpack that they could not believe that I wasn't a drug dealer. They said,
Wow.
there's just no way. And I had to like show them that all the pills had my name on it. You know, I had talked them through what I did every day. They could not believe. And that should have been a sign for me. It wasn't, but it should have been. That's how many pills I was taking every day. And they weren't making me better. And so now, after 5 or 6 years of increasing amounts of medication, of trying new things, because like I said, I wasn't getting better, I hit a point where I just went, this is never going to get better. And part of that was that I was living with a bunch of people who I considered close friends. And in reality, they weren't bad people. In fact, most of them were very, very good people. But the only thing we had in common is we were all struggling with substance misuse together. So there was like 10, 11 of us living in this house. And we would just use together from morning to night because we all had different drugs around. So that was the sort of situation I was in. And I had just gotten back from following a band that I really loved around the country to like 4 or 5 different music festivals. I was exhausted. I wasn't eating well. I wasn't sleeping well. I had spent this month living out of my car, just driving around, going to these different music festivals, and also using a lot of drugs, as I always did. And I got home and I just crashed. And you know, it sort of all dawned on me that here I was at 23. I wasn't accomplishing the things that I thought I should be. I was estranged from most of my family and my friends because substance misuse has the unique ability in terms of diseases to actually drive your friends and family away instead of pulling them around you like most other issues of mental health or health at all do. And I just said that I was done. I dumped out what I thought would be a lethal dosage of some of these pills and called a friend as a living suicide note to tell her what I was going to do. And that was it for me.
Wow. Yeah. That's wow. The best thing I can say about that is that you're here telling the tale.
And I was super lucky in that respect that so I attempted suicide twice in 2 days. And it's because the first day I called the friend and she kept me on the phone and texted a couple other friends of mine who rushed over and stopped me. But the next night I learned from that mistake and I took the pills first and then called the same friend. And this time she called 911. And I don't remember much because I overdosed that night, but I do remember being thrown in the backseat of a cop car and spending the night handcuffed to a bed at a hospital. And again, super lucky that I made it through. I mean, you know, I two suicide attempts and an overdose in the span of 48 hours should spell, you know, the end. And luckily for me, for whatever reason, the equation was on my side that time.
Definitely. So you've got this hashtag behind you, and this, and also I mentioned right at the start of that piece, that people have this stigma around a lot of these issues: substance misuse, substance abuse, suicide, depression, mental health, anxiety, all these kind of things. There's still now, even in 2020, there's still this kind of stigma around all of these issues. And you've got that hashtag there and the stigma. Yeah. What's the reason? Why do you think that there is this stigma? But not just why, how can we get out the other side, and how can we drop the stigma, end the stigma, and move forward and help people that are struggling? And obviously, without going into the whole COVID thing, we've come out of this period, or we might be coming out of it. We might be going back into it, this lockdown of the world being a completely different place. So there are a lot of people and there might be some people listening to this that are in that situation, that are struggling, that are not in the best place. So why is it a stigma, and how can we get rid of it?
Well, again, thank you for asking that question. And I do a lot of these, you know, as you know, when you're in this world, sort of, we have a great community of people who do podcasts and shows, and we all go on each other's shows. So I do these a lot, and I don't often get asked the why question. I get asked a lot, what can we do about it? And that's incredibly important. But understanding why is the first step to making real change. So there's sort of two answers there. And number one, when it comes to,
I asked there.
Yes. Well, when it comes to substance misuse, right, you actually have to take it first back to substance use, and that's just drugs. we have a stigma around drugs, and this goes back in the US over 100 years, where our drug laws and our drug policies and our views on drugs are 100% unequivocally based in racism. And there is so much proof that it almost feels silly to try to explain why, because a lot of it is they didn't even hide it, right? Perfect example, and I'll start with one of the earlier laws. In the 1910s in the US, a law was passed against opium, not the kind that was used in medicine at the time, because that was still a common thing, but the kind that was smoked. It was the exact same opium, just the way it was presented was different. And the reason they passed it, and it's in the bill, they didn't hide it, they said it right there in the bill, we are outlawing smoking opium because the Chinese are the ones doing this. It was flat out in the law. So that becomes the basis of a lot of drug views on drug culture in the U.S. You know, you take it through the 30s and 40s, where marijuana and heroin were viewed as negative because of the jazz scene in the U.S., and then it turns into the hippies in the 60s, and Richard Nixon's famous war on drugs, which is still going on. His top advisor in the 90s gave an interview not long before he died saying, look, we couldn't make it illegal to be black. We couldn't make it illegal to be a hippie. We could make it illegal to use the drugs that those groups enjoyed. And so in doing so, turn the attention of America and against these groups and make them the others. I mean, flat out, he says this. So that is why drug use is stigmatized the way that it is today. So the reason that substance misuse still has a stigma is that it's seen as a moral failing because only bad people, quote unquote, use drugs, which we all know isn't true, because most of us have tried drugs. Most of us use different forms of substances in one way or another. And the idea of addiction being a negative thing is only in context. If you take it away from drugs or substances, period, people who are addicted to working out, we see those people as someone worthy of emulating, when the idea is, yeah, working out is incredible. I'm going to the gym today. I did it yesterday. It's a good thing for us. But when it becomes an unhealthy thing, that's just as bad for you as, what we would say is over drinking or anything like that. Anything in over moderation is not a good thing. And yet people who work out a lot, we look at The Rock, who spends most of his days in the gym. We go, yeah, that guy is awesome. Well, yeah, he's doing a lot of awesome things, but maybe he has an unhealthy relationship with the gym. So I think that needs to be said, is that it really is in context. When it comes to something other than substances, we don't look at addiction as a negative thing. It's only when they're using things that we don't like. So that's number one. And then number two, with mental health, it's sort of the same thing. We have this fear of the mind and the way that it could go wrong. When our body breaks down, we can see it. We can understand it, right? We all know if you break your leg, well, this is what happens and this is how you get fixed. But if your mind is going bad, that is terrifying, because none of us really know what to do about that or how to fix it. And we're still in the Wild West when it comes to the mind. We're learning new things every day, but we are a long way from understanding the mind to the extent that we do the body. And so when someone's mental health starts to falter in a way that is scary to us, there is that there but the grace of God go I feeling of, well, we don't really understand what's happening. Yeah, we understand it in basic terms. Well, their chemicals are off in their brain, but we don't know why that happens for a lot of people. And for us, we're sitting over here going, please don't let that happen to me. Please don't let that happen to me. So it's easier for us, and a lot of this is subconscious. We don't choose to do this, but it's easier for us to say, okay, that person is different from me. I will never have to experience that. And instead of recognizing that person is struggling with a health issue the same way I am. And, if you're going through cancer, if you're going through any of these other giant diseases that are terrorizing a lot of people, it is no different than someone struggling with their mental health. It's just scarier to us.
So ultimately, boxing things up in different boxes and labeling things in certain ways is not helping the situation.
It rarely does, and especially now. No, it's definitely not.
Yeah. It's like these ones over here are okay, but these ones aren't.
That's right. And we do that with a lot of things, and this is not just the US. We as people are very black and white thinkers, and it harms us always. It's never a good thing when we think in black and white terms. And we all do this from time to time. But when it comes to these issues that should be seen on a spectrum, but instead are seen in different camps, in black and white, this is good, this is bad, it's very easy to label somebody bad that isn't that different from you. And I'll give a very quick scientific study on this. Recently, there was an article in Psychology Today about how doctors are starting to treat people with what they call borderline personality disorder, which is essentially on that mental health spectrum. They're not quite in the category of being labeled bipolar or something like that, but they clearly are struggling with some kind of issue of mental health in the personality disorder spectrum. They're starting to treat them no differently than they do people with bipolar, because what they finally realize is if this person has 99% of the qualifications of someone who's struggling with bipolar, but they're missing that final piece that would knock them over the line, why would we treat that any different than if they had 1 percentage point more of what we're looking for in a qualification? So again, it's that black and white thinking that was keeping a lot of people from getting the treatment that they deserved. And now they've started saying, what, that's ridiculous. If you're anywhere in this spectrum, we're going to treat you as if you have, what's going on here.
What's the solution? What's the how to get around the stigma? So you spoke about why these viewpoints and these thoughts and these belief systems are ingrained into people, but how do we get off it or get away from it? I mean, there's a couple of things that sprung to my mind as you said that last section. And the first one was, I want to ask you, what's your views on legalizing or changing the laws around some of these substances? That was one thing that I wanted to ask you. And the second one is, and I kind of know the answer, but I want to get your view on it, is why aren't our health practitioners, our doctors, our therapists, prescribing the stuff that we know that can help them, like meditation, exercise, movement, eating good nutrition, grounding, fresh air, vitamin D, the list goes on, all the things that nature can give us? They were two things that sprung to my mind whilst you were speaking. So if you could touch on them as well, that would be amazing.
Definitely. So we could do an entire episode and some on this subject alone. And this is why I do a lot of what I do. Is the idea of stigma is so foolish to me. You know what I mean? Like this idea that we just shouldn't talk about it and things will get better or whatever. Like that's never happened ever in the history of the world. Not talking about something has never helped it. So it's why I do what I do. It's get up here. And that's my answer for number one, by the way, is telling our stories and normalizing conversations around issues of mental health and substance misuse is the easiest way to start breaking down stigma. And we've seen it with other things as well. And I'll give you a perfect example that our generation knows full well, and that is sex ed. Before our generation, it was basically abstinence-only sex ed, right? Don't have sex and everything will be fine. No, kids are going to have sex. Teenagers are going to have sex. If we don't teach them about safe ways to do it, they're just going to have unsafe sex. So we started teaching safer sex ed, and lo and behold, teenage pregnancies dropped. Like, who would have thought? So that's number one, is just talking about these things in an honest way. And I mean honest because a lot of times when parents talk to their kids about drugs, it's basically, oh, drugs are bad. Well, if you tell that to a kid and they try it and they love it, what do you think they're going to do? So instead, we need to have honest conversations where it's like, look, let me tell you about my experiences. I had no idea what my parents, their drug history before I really started using. And then we started talking about it. But if we have these honest conversations, the good, the bad, my experience with substance misuse, that is a way to help your child understand that not only are these things good in times and bad in times, but that they can talk to you. If they have questions, if they are struggling, I never thought I could talk to my parents about what I was going through, not because they were bad parents, I love them very much, but because this was an issue that was always drilled into me is bad. Drug use is bad. So if that's your idea, if there's this stigma around it, there's no way that we can actually have these honest conversations. So that's number one, is just talking about it, telling our stories and advocating for other people to do so. As far as your question about, why our legalization versus decriminalization. That's sort of the big one that's going on in the industry right now, is which is first and which is the ultimate goal. For your listeners, very quickly, decriminalization means the thing is not legal. It's not like you can walk down the street and buy it in a shop like you can with some with medical marijuana or legal marijuana here in a lot of the states. But it also means that if you get caught with it, you're not going to jail, and that's currently how it is with a lot of drugs here in the US, at least. So that's usually seen as the first step, is decriminalizing. And what we've realized is that criminalization of drug use has gotten us nowhere. There's been a lot of studies that have shown that drug use has continued to grow at the rates they expected, if not higher, since the war on drugs began back in the 70s here in the US. What that shows you is the only thing criminalizing drug use has done is destroyed entire generations of mostly Black and brown Americans and almost 100% poor Americans. For me, example, I got arrested for marijuana use and intent to sell and all that kind of stuff when I was a freshman in college. You know what happened? I got a lawyer. I paid for a lawyer who got me out of jail, got everything off my record. Everything was fine. That's not the case for poor Americans. That's not the case for Black and brown Americans who end up having their entire lives destroyed over a small bag of marijuana, which is just ridiculous. So decriminalization is the number one step. Legalization is an ideal that would be wonderful. I think that we're seeing with places like Portugal that it can happen. I'm sorry, in Portugal, I believe they decriminalized, they didn't legalize everything.
In Portugal, they've decriminalized every
Right.
classification of drug, but not legalized, as far as to my knowledge.
Right.
I have read into this, and I'm pretty sure every drug in Portugal is decriminalized. And since that, again, I'd ask all the listeners to do their own research, and for you as well, Jay, to check it out. But as far as I know, crime rates in relation to drug-related crime has gone down ever since they did that. And they did it a long time ago, as far as I can make out. I think it might have been like 2009 or something, like quite a long time ago. So it's been like that in Portugal for a while.
That's right. And you're right. Thank you for correcting me. They have not legalized. What I was thinking of is Amsterdam, where some drugs are legal. And it's been more of a mixed bag in Portugal, which you're completely correct. The decriminalization there has led to a extreme drop in crime around the issues of substance misuse and substances, period. So I do think that this is one that we are sort of breaking new frontiers around. And unfortunately, what we've seen a lot of is that the U.S. is the sort of a lighthouse on this issue. And as long as the U.S. continues to see all drugs as bad, there are a lot of countries that are following suit. And rightly or wrongly, the U.S. on a lot of issues is sort of the big name in the room. And as long as we are on the wrong side of this, you're not going to see as much movement as should happen, despite the fact that there have been countless leaders around the world who have pushed the UN to do the opposite and sort of come out against a lot of what the US has been doing as far as substances. So I do think that that's going to be sort of the next frontier, is seeing this change on a global scale. And we're already seeing some of that. Mexico has been a leading voice on cannabis research and decriminalization of cannabis for a long time. Not saying they don't have their own issues, obviously, but being outspoken on this issue. They've had former presidents come out against what the U.S. has been doing as far as drug laws. So really interesting stuff happening on the world scale when it comes to substance misuse. As far as the question around why aren't therapists recommending some of the more holistic and common sense ideas around how to treat some of these issues, the answer is flat out money. I mean, it's just that simple. It's money. Yeah. A lot. So I'll give this kind of two ways, from my own perspective, but also from what I've seen by talking to clients. I am not a PhD. I never want to replace a therapist. I think that many therapists are very good at what they do. When I tell my clients, that we're going to work, and this is how we're going to work together, I relate it to this. I am to your therapist as your personal trainer is to your doctor, right? If you go to the gym and you tell your personal trainer that your back is hurting, or you think you may have broken your leg, your trainer is going to say, dude, go to the doctor. Why are you talking to me about this? But if you go to your doctor and say, hey, doc, what should I lift in the gym tonight? Hopefully the doctor's going to go, I have no idea. Why are you asking me this, right? So for a long time, there hasn't been that relationship. Therapists have been everything, right? They've been forced to talk about extreme issues of mental health, which is what they're good at for the most part. A lot of them are sort of general practitioners. They don't really specialize in anything. I personally was working with a very wonderful therapist, and when I wanted to start doing some trauma work, it really wasn't going well. And I finally said, hey, doc, I don't think this is working. And he said, I'm so glad you said that. I really don't know enough about trauma to help you in this. Maybe you should go see a trauma specialist. And that's what we did. And but I'm glad I spoke up, and it wasn't his fault. He is just, because of where his industry is, he's been forced to do too much, right? It's as if right now we're going to our proctologist to ask him to clean our teeth. It just doesn't make any sense. I mean, we shouldn't be forcing them to do everything. And so we need more people in the mental health space who are willing to advocate for things exactly like you said. And that's, again, what I do with my coaching. We work on the stuff that is, quite frankly, it shouldn't be the things you're working on with your therapist. You should be working with your therapist on the really heavy things. That's what they're good at. If you're asking them about mindfulness, about meditation, about journaling, about spending time outdoors, about getting good exercise to free up some brain space, you're not using your time with them well. And you're also really only getting the tip of the iceberg. So we need more people in these spaces to advocate for these ideas, to free up therapists to really focus on what they're good at.
What I want to touch on off the back of what you've just said is two things. The first one is, I think in a lot of industries, scientific, medical, my industry, which is health and fitness, and also the holistic industries, is there's still like this element of ego. So it's like, I can't refer it to this person. I don't want us to step on their toes, or vice versa. And to some extent, we need to let that go, because if we're together as an organized unit, we can help that individual more effectively, rather than, well, I don't know how to do that, or attempting to do it when you don't know because your ego is getting in the way. So that was one thing I think that needed to be mentioned. There needs some more integrated work, and it is happening. And the other thing that I wanted to say was that I do think this will happen over the next few years, is we will see some system shifts, some system changes. I mean, we're already seeing them, and economical shifts as well, that will change a lot of these issues of the substances and the drugs, and all of that area. I think will be changed by the shifts we're seeing in systems, in economics, and in society as well.
Couldn't agree more. And I love it. The ego piece is so huge, and I think it shows up in a couple of ways. I mean, you hit the nail on the head on people sort of being afraid to say, this isn't really, what I'm great at. I can't, I don't want to recommend somebody else because, whatever. And I think it comes from fear. I get this a lot. Again, I am very outspoken on these issues, and I do a lot of my work on LinkedIn, mostly because I think we need to be talking about these issues in the workplace. And I think that because we spend so much of our time with our coworkers, yes, our family and our friends should be the ones that know us really well and can be looking out if our mental health is struggling. But if you're struggling at work, you need to be able to feel comfortable about talking about these issues with your coworkers. And so when I post on LinkedIn, I get a lot of pushback from people, mostly with PhDs, who essentially are saying, you have no right to be doing this work. And they say that because they've spent, decade and a half, 20 years, 30 years, whatever, researching and working on this. And there's almost a fear of them going, well, if he can do this without doing all this, then I really need to do all of that research. And at the end of the day, the answer is, you can study all of this as hard as you did, and we need you to do that, because that's how we discover new methods, and that's how we make these giant strides towards better treatment. But at the end of the day, you can't study your way into understanding what it feels like to live with this. I did that. And by the way, you shouldn't want to. But that doesn't mean that you should also exclude me from the table. It means we all need to be doing this work together. So that's always my pushback on them is I'm not trying to replace you. I'm trying to work with you. And if your idea is get out of my sandbox, it just shows fear on your part. So
Yeah,
when we're losing thousands of people every year, I mean, millions across the globe to substance abuse issues, to suicide, there is no room for my way or the highway thinking. We all need to be working on this thing together.
Yeah, definitely. And that goes across the board on a lot of subject areas and topics and issues. It's all about working together. And I think we have nailed it between us that it's the money, it's the power struggle, it's the ego, it's the fear. Those are the things that are preventing us from moving forward and moving together as oneness, as unity, and eliminating, well, not necessarily eliminating, but at least reducing a lot of these issues. That's what it's all about. And I want to give you two examples of this as well for yourself and the listeners. About the first one's about cross referring and knowing when it's not your place. I had a client a couple of years ago. He was doing a personal training session with me. He was like, he didn't do anything strenuous, just a few lifts. And he was like, oh, I've got pain in my chest. I'm not feeling too good. And if I let my ego get involved, it could have been, oh, do a few stretches and you'll be okay. But I knew that it was something else because he wasn't doing anything strenuous and he had a pain in his chest. I was like, look, you need to go and just get checked out. Like after this session, put yourself into the doctor or go to the hospital and get checked out. He did as he was told, and basically within 24 hours of him going into the hospital to get checked, he was in having open heart surgery. And basically I saved his life by referring him to a doctor. So this is what I mean about how we need to work together. If it's not I'm all for like crossing lanes and helping and trying to support people. But if you know flat out that you cannot help that person and you don't have the skill set, then push them on. Yeah. And the second thing I wanted to mention was that it's great about what you're saying about putting across your experience and your expertise and your story, because yes, you can have all the bits of paper in the world, but if you've not lived it, sometimes you can't explain it from that perspective and that point of view. So I think it's great to tell your stories, to share your stories, because ultimately what do we relate to and what do we respond to on the deepest level? It's stories. That's how we can, about how our brains work and how we've evolved to interact with things. So the stories are going to help progress us forward and help people understand these issues and also deal with them in a more effective way.
I couldn't agree more. And it's why, I always accept every opportunity to tell my story, unless, let me rephrase that. I don't accept every opportunity. I accept every opportunity if I think I'm the right person for that opportunity. And perfect example was just last week, somebody reached out to me and said, I'm the organizer of a group for young Black and Brown Americans, basically a club, and I want to do a presentation on mental health. I would love to bring you in. And I responded with, I really, by the way, I really appreciate it. And I would love to. Would you mind if I recommended someone they may identify with more as someone who is not, Black or brown and who was never poor? And the person said, sure. And I recommended someone I thought was a better fit. And, that guy got the gig and it's coming up, and I respect that person a lot, which is why I recommended him in the first place. I wouldn't recommend someone that I didn't trust, but obviously recommended him. So, I missed what could have been a very nice payday, but that's not why I do this. And at the end of the day, if I'm not the right fit, thank you for reaching out, but I will help you find the right fit that can actually have the impact that you're looking to have. So the telling your story piece is incredibly important, but we also need to be making sure that ours is the right story, because mine isn't one that a lot of that everyone can identify with. I think there are parts of it that most people can. But there are other people that will fit an opportunity better than me. And, that's something that I do, whether it's coaching or speaking, is that if I'm not the right fit for you, I will guarantee you that I can help you find the right person.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that ultimately shows two things. It shows integrity, and it also shows courage as well, because a lot of people may also have that fear of, oh, I don't want to pass it on to someone else because I risk losing credibility or money or whatever the case may be. So definitely shows integrity and courage. Okay, I'm conscious of the time, so I want to touch on some of the techniques and methodologies you use when you're helping people. So obviously one of your big things is going around sharing your stories, sharing your messages through podcasting, through public speaking, etc. But when you're helping somebody or you're trying to support that individual, what's some of the techniques, methodologies you use to help them with mental health, with all of these things we've been talking about today?
Yeah, definitely. So you're right that a lot of what we've talked about is sort of the big picture stuff. But when it comes to the actual one-on-one or me with a group, a lot of what I advocate is, from little things you can do in your life, which is sort of still big picture, but more action items, things like being vulnerable, being open, breaking down this idea that to fail in some way is a sign of weakness. And it's so harmful because it makes people not take risks. And it also has people walking around in fear. So those are sort of bigger picture things that I talk about with groups, but particularly with individuals, when I'm doing coaching work, we focus a lot on, mindfulness is a huge piece, but that's sort of a big buzzword at this point, right? So, we do talk about meditation, but at the end of the day, meditation is difficult for a lot of people. And while it's a wonderful tool, and I love when my clients can find the benefit of mindfulness from meditation, there are other ways that are a little bit easier, a little bit more attainable for people. So, number one, I have people decide how they're going to do mindful practices. And I come with a whole list of different ways that people can, and making sure they're doing at least one or two of those every day to help someone get more in touch with themselves. I often describe it as our subconscious and our conscious minds. They're like a garden. And if you don't know what's growing there, you'd be surprised at some of the weeds that blossom up, right? So, understanding a way to get down into your subconscious and knowing what's going on down there is key. And I think everyone should be doing this, regardless of if you think you're struggling or not. I just think it's a really helpful thing to learn about yourself more. So that's number one. And then also number two is sort of understanding a little bit more about the ways our brains work. And that's especially important if it's someone who's currently struggling with a substance misuse issue. Yes, it's important to get off or to stop using these substances in such a harmful way. But as someone else that I worked with described it, if you focus on the substances themselves, that's like focusing on the marks on your skin when you have chicken pox. Yes, we can cover over the marks and then call yourself better, but that's not how it works. You need to understand the disease that's going on underneath the skin. So when it comes to substance misuse, it's understanding the ways that our brains are wired and why we're chasing what we're chasing in the substance use. So it's talking with somebody about being mindful in what they are searching for when they use substances, and also finding other ways to achieve some of that release of dopamine and uncovering happiness in their brain. So everything from personal affirmations, philanthropy is a big part of what I teach, and it doesn't have to be, $1,000 gifts or anything like that, but it can be little things like, little acts of philanthropy, like paying for the person behind you in line, in Starbucks or something like that. And it's, you do these little actions and they start to reinforce a belief in yourself that you are a good person. And by doing that, you can change the way you view yourself with a lot of work. Obviously, I'm making it sound very easy. And so it's sort of just a broad spectrum of understanding yourself as a person and changing the way that you talk to yourself and changing the way that you see yourself to help achieve a more, I always struggle with using the word actualize, but that's really what we're all going for, right? Is that we want to be a more fulfilled person. And the way to do that is as I boil it down to, is choose your struggle. And that means knowing what you want out of life, knowing the goals you want to achieve, and making sure you are actualizing your life on that path. Because at the end of the day, if we're chasing somebody else's ideas of success, whether it's, society as a whole, or maybe mom or dad, if they were really heavy-handed in our upbringing, we're never going to be fulfilled, and we're never going to find that happiness that it will be elusive to us our entire lives. So it's a lot of sort of getting back down to ground level and understanding who you are as a person, and then rebuilding yourself up from there.
Yeah, doing the deep work. That's what I said. Yeah, that's
Yes.
what it's ultimately boils down to, isn't it?
Yep. Yeah, and I also think, by the way, this is something that is not unique. I think this is something that's universal in the idea that we're not taught these things, right? I mean, we have physical education class growing up, and like we were saying earlier, you may have health class, which teaches you about sex ed and what we put in our body and all that kind of stuff. But we don't spend time talking about ideas like empathy, like vulnerability, like these mental health pillars of who we are. And then we expect people just to know how to do these things. And it's silly and it's sad. And it's why we have so many people who are struggling with these ideas. We need to be teaching people from an early age that the idea is to be the best person you can be and the happiest person you can be. And all the other stuff will come with it. But if we're continuing to teach that the goal of life is to be successful by society's terms, which is getting straight A's and making a lot of money and doing all these things that don't actually bring you happiness, we're just going to keep producing miserable people.
Yeah, that just rewinds back to what I was saying earlier. I do think we're going to see some shifts. I think we're going to see some changes, global changes that I'd like to believe are going to take us in the right direction. I think we're going to see a lot more of a harmonious, unified planet, I'd like to think. And that's what you said there about we were not taught any of this thing. I nearly said it earlier, and I don't want to go political or anything, but just I feel like this is a bit of a setup. We need these system changes for us to thrive, because we're almost set up to fail at the moment, and this is why we're having these problems and these issues. I do think things are going to change and get better, but it needs to be a deeper rooted change, in my opinion, in my personal opinion.
Man, I couldn't agree more. We've got a lot of really ugly, our garden is not clean at the moment. And we've got a lot of things that we got to tear down to the root and sort of replant if we want this to go in a better direction. There are a lot of weeds growing, and yet people want to keep working with the garden that we were given. And it's like, I mean, yeah, we can make incremental changes, but if you're not willing to get down to the root and tear out the horribleness that's down there, we're not going to make the wholesale change that we need. And it's a lot easier to do that. It's a lot easier to just keep picking up at the sort of top of leaves and, well, it's going to get better if we just tear this one up. No, you got to get down to the bottom, do the hard work and put it in now, or nothing's ever going to get better.
Completely agree. What would you say then is your biggest life lesson to date? What's the one thing that you'd say that this has been the biggest lesson, the biggest maybe wake up call for you? I know that's a very difficult question to maybe answer, but I just wanted to throw that out there and see what you say.
No, not at all. And I think I've got a bigger thing that ties in two things together, and that is, I've mentioned choose your struggle, but let me kind of break that down a little bit more. When I was at my worst, I really didn't get to choose what I struggled for, right? My struggle was to get off the couch, to avoid withdrawals, to be a human being. That's when I was struggling with my addiction. But now I get to choose again. And it's helped teach me that we as people are often in the same position I was in when I was struggling with addiction, which is we're not choosing, right? We're letting, like I said, either mom and dad or society or whatever choose for us. And it leads to us not being happy, not being fulfilled, not being actualized. So that's number one, is we have to make sure we're choosing what we are going for and what we want to struggle for with our lives. But number two, it sort of ties into that, is we as people let fear dominate us a lot. And we've talked a lot about fear, whether it's fear of losing your status or money or whatever the case is. And for 5 years after I entered recovery, I let fear of losing my status keep me from talking about being in recovery and these issues of mental health and substance misuse. And I had a buddy who runs an organization that does storytelling, and he wanted me to tell my story, and it would have been a big deal. These are I'm talking about 150, 200 people, whatever the case is, hearing these stories, right? And he knew I was in recovery, but I was always saying, no, I don't want to do it. So one day after he asked me for the third time, I was at home having dinner with my parents, and I told my dad that I had this opportunity. And he was like, well, why wouldn't you do it? And I said, because I'm scared. I don't want people to know. And he just looked at me and it's like, fear is never a good reason not to do something. And then he went back to reading the paper as if he didn't realize he'd just blown my entire world up. So the next day I went to my buddy and I was like, all right, ask me again. He asked me, I said yes. And I told my story and it launched me on this career that I'm now on 5 years later. That one night of my dad telling me I was being an idiot launched this career I'm on. So it all ties together. We are scared of doing something different. We're scared of questioning these things that are deeply ingrained in us. We're scared of trying to be the change. And it keeps us from making these real changes that need to happen, both for society, but also for our lives and for us to be happy. So at the end of the day, choose your struggle and realize that fear is never a good reason not to do something.
Love it. Absolutely love it. Let's finish this podcast then, Jay, with firstly, what can the listeners do immediately after this podcast to make changes? So let's say somebody is listening to this and they are struggling, or maybe they're not even struggling, but they want to make some changes and move forward. If you had to give somebody listening 1 to 2 pieces of advice, what would they be right off the bat?
Yeah, 100%. So number one, I never leave whether it's a speaking gig or an interview without saying this one message, and that is reach out. The days of suffering and silence are over, and it's because there are enough of us who want to talk about these issues. So when I was going through my worst, I didn't tell anybody. It was because I didn't know that people wanted to talk about it. Now we don't have that excuse because we're talking about this all the time. So there's a saying that we have in this industry, and that is, we would rather spend 2 hours talking to you tomorrow than 2 hours attending your funeral the next day. Reach out. If you are struggling, reach out. It can be to me. It can be to our amazing host here. It doesn't matter. You have somebody in your life who wants to hear from you. So reach out and someone will be there, whether it's just to validate your bullshit, that's fine. I mean, we will do that. The thing is, you just cannot struggle in silence. So that's number one. Number two, if you're not currently feeling that way, you can still do things to better actualize your life and to find more happiness. Do mindfulness practices. If you want to learn about some, reach out to one of us. I mean, they're everywhere. You know, meditation is great, but it's not the only one. There are a lot of good mindfulness practices, and you will be shocked at the things you uncover if you do some mindfulness stuff. So definitely spend some time getting to know yourself better. Sit with the things that come up, because continuing to hide from them, it's not going to get you anywhere.
Perfect. Great advice. Yeah, definitely. I'll second that. If anybody needs any help or just a shoulder to cry on or anyone to speak to, just reach out to us. And that's not no monetary exchange involved, just somebody to speak to or somebody to hear or listen, then reach out to either of us. And if you don't want to reach out to us too, there's plenty of people out there that will listen to you and will help you. So don't hesitate to do that. And Don't be scared to do it. We spoke a lot about fear. Don't be scared.
Couldn't agree more.
Okay, Jay, where can the listeners go to find out more about you and what you do and how you help people?
Well, you can find the Choose Your Struggle podcast everywhere you get your podcast. You can find me at my website, jayshifman.com, JAYSHIFMAN.com. And I'm on all of your social medias at either Choose Your Struggle or Jay Shifman. So search for those and let's chat. I mean it. Reach out. I want to hear from you. These topics are incredibly important, and we all need to be talking about them together.
Perfect. I've loved that. I've loved the show. I've loved this episode. It's been super powerful. Can you just end the show and this podcast with a favorite quote? This can be one of your own, something you live by, something from somebody else. Just hit us with a favorite quote to end the show.
Definitely. So one of the quotes I used the first time I ever spoke publicly was Nietzsche, who said, "He who has a reason to live can bear anyhow." And that is essentially, choose what you're going to struggle for, and the rest of it will fall into place.
Love it, my man. Thank you so much. You have a blessed day.
Y'all know him as the superstar stand-up and blockbuster actor, but did you know that Kevin Hart is also a New York Times best-selling author? And he's back with his second book, The Decision, Overcoming Today's BS for Tomorrow's Success. And you can get it today on Audible. Just for signing up, they're going to give you 2 free audiobooks and a select free Audible original to get started. So go to the link in my show notes and sign up for Audible today.